Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anya Sirota. I'm an associate dean here and a professor in architecture. And I am so pleased to welcome Barbara Bestor to Taubman College. But first, a little bit about this lecture. Herbert, Johe, and his wife Suzanne endowed a fund at Taubman College to support lectures, exhibitions, and visiting teachers, keeping architecture a living conversation. A Carnegie Mellon graduate, Johe joined Michigan in '47 and over nearly 4 decades served in key leadership roles before retiring in '84. Known for his passion for teaching, his love of drawing and painting, and his generosity to students, he continued teaching even in retirement. His legacy endures in the college's culture and the lives of those he taught. So it's in that spirit of architecture as both rigorous and generous that we welcome tonight's lecture. At a moment when architectural discourse was dominated by white box abstraction and heroic formalism, Barbara Bestor staged something entirely different. Instead of chasing purity, she designed silent disco in Los Angeles, bold, pop, outrageous. She made home office hybrids for film industry clients, mixing plywood, saturated color, improvisational culture of Silver Lake. And soon after, she was sketching what would become Blackbirds, a new housing typology that showed zoning could be as much a design instrument as form. Each of these moves was a counterpoint, architecture that was rigorous without asceticism, cultural without being frivolous, and utterly unapologetic in its embrace of contemporary life. Barbara Bestor, FAIA, founded Bestor Architecture in Los Angeles in 1995. She was trained first on the East Coast at Harvard, then detoured into experimentation at the Architecture Association in London, and finally was shaped at SciArc in Los Angeles. That oscillation between the gravitas of the East Coast and the openness of the West has stayed with her. It gives her work a double register. Historically literate, yet culturally porous, equally at home in a Lautner restoration and a paper magazine pop-up. Her practice, now nearly 30 years on, has only grown stronger. From its beginnings in residential work and small cultural commissions, it has become a 25-person studio producing some of Los Angeles's most inventive architecture. Beats by Dre headquarters, Snapchat's collaborative offices, the Silver Lake Conservatory of Music, Ashes and Diamonds Winery, and restorations of John Lautner's Silvertop and Neutra houses. These are not just projects, they are arguments that workplaces can be interior cities, that medium density housing can produce real neighborhoods, that preservation is pedagogy, and that architecture is not a backdrop to culture, it is culture. Barbara's capacity to move across grains, art, music, fashion, technology has made her a central figure in Los Angeles's creative networks. Clients become collaborators, collaborators become friends, and projects often become cultural platforms in their own right. She has curated exhibitions, written Bohemian Modern, and led the Julia Schulman Institute, where she widened the frame of architectural photography. And there is a persistence here. Barbara Bestor's architecture is not a practice of fleeting moments. It is a practice that has sustained its pluralism for three decades, and if anything, is hitting its best stride now. Barbara has resisted narrowing into a style or a silo. Instead, she treats every commission as a chance to pose architectural questions in dialogue with the present. That persistence, that willingness to stay experimental over time, it has its own rigor. Barbara's practice is feminist in the most structural sense. It refuses the defaults architecture too easily accepts. When women-led firms were rare in Los Angeles, she founded one, not by replicating the profession's norms, but by redesigning the very terms of operation. She organized her office around care, not as a sentiment, but as a method. Listening as rigor, collaboration as structure, histories as resources, and life itself as ground. In doing so, she unsettles the field's tendency to abstract, to universalize, to erase. Feminism here is not an add-on, it is architecture's counter-infrastructure. I also know Barbara outside of Los Angeles, from Block Island, where she is, quite simply, a star. Her generosity there is evident in quiet pro bono work for affordable housing and in the way she folds her architectural intelligence into community life. It's the same ethos she brings everywhere, a conviction that architecture is inseparable from culture, from networks of people, and from the daily practices that make a place. And perhaps most crucially, Barbara's practice demonstrates how to bridge across oppositions. East and West Coast, preservation and invention, rigor and play, popular culture, high design. These are not binaries to be chosen between, but tensions to be held together. At a time when single-mindedness dominates so much of public discourse, this capacity to build across divides is vital. It models a form of architectural intelligence, and really civic intelligence, that we urgently need. And for those of us in Detroit, the resonance is clear. Adaptive reuse as cultural infrastructure, housing that stitches density into neighborhood life, workplaces designed as collaborative commons. These are our questions too. Barbara shows us how architecture can be rigorous and playful and joyful, historical and experimental, serious and audacious at once. So tonight, we welcome an architect whose practice has persisted, matured, and still surprises, an architect who insists that architecture belongs fully to culture, and that strange beauty is not an indulgence, but a civic right. So please join me in welcoming Barbara Bestor.
Holy tamale, that's going to be hard to follow up, I gotta say. Thank you so much, Anya. Thanks for having me. It's so great to have a whole house here. I know you guys are really busy. You've been sitting with this quote. I love this quote just because I do think that it helps us all as architects remember to be humble, because I mean, we all sort of are guilty of changing our path. Discourse, you get trained in something rigorous, and then like 10 years later, you're interested in something totally different, and like that's okay. I'm saying that to students, it's okay. And I think at this moment, I'm sure everybody feels it's a little hectic. Like, what is the dominant discourse? Well, maybe not, isn't one right now, but that idea that you can kind of mine the past and work with the past and imagine new futures. That's something I'm really interested in. I want to start just in a kind of career-y sense, because you guys are students. Like, I was working already for maybe 8 years teaching and having a very small practice, and various things happened in my life. I got divorced, I had to find somewhere to live, and I had this crazy thing. I bought this house, this one, to live in with my 2 kids as a single mom. My joke is that it reminded me of Unabomber House, but not because, well, I was partially, yes, I was angry, but also I did like the kind of classical shape of, the kids' drawing of a house. Somehow that became attractive. I was trained in a very rigorous neo-modern moment in architecture, kind of like the late 80s, early 90s. We rejected postmodernism. We were interested in white boxes, and this was kind of a change of plan. I first was going to clad the whole thing in mirrors because I was interested in disappearing, all kinds of stuff. But then I ended up doing this house, kind of simple, but some big moves. And the thing that happened, and this is why I show it, is that it ended up, it was like not acceptable to dwell because it didn't have a flat roof, which at the time you had to have. This was 20 years ago. But it did get in the New York Times. And because of the New York Times and the home section, all this stuff happened, and my career just started to go crazy, and also had this other, language of color and pink and stuff. I had these 2 girls, they like pink. I was like, oh my God, pink. And then now I really like pink. But anyhow, it was sort of a learning curve. The idea of it was just sort of that the garden and the house were doubles of each other. They were the same footprint, and you could kind of circulate in a party, or if you were a kid on a bike, you kind of circulate the same way, sort of in and out of the house. But really, as a story, it kind of ended up getting published a bunch, because at the time it was this, let's say, neo-postmodern something moment, maybe, where the idea of that shape kind of seemed to resonate. And because of it, I got this amazing book deal to do a book of my choosing, which ended up being a book I worked on about, I would call it the alternative history of modernism in Los Angeles. At the, again, the faculty here know, but like 20 years ago, people still thought of modern architecture as kind of this Miesian, minimalism exclusively. But actually, the work of, say, Schindler, there's like a drawing about Schindler done by Jeff McFetrich, who did the illustrations for the book. and Gregory Ain and a lot of other people in LA, they were doing these very interesting, weird shapes, sizes, a lot of stuff that inspired Frank Gehry. Was, coming from this previous generation. But so I kind of set out to do a book about the lived experience of and kind of alternative expressiveness of modernism in architecture, and it sort of was also about the people who lived in the houses and the neighborhoods, and so it was sort of, and then it was designed by this wonderful team from CalArts, Michael Worthington and others who were into like blasting apart conventions of Swiss modernism and graphic design. So it's like super graphic, which at the moment was a thing, different now maybe more common. And so that kind of was what started me off. So that was maybe, the house was maybe around 2002. The first publication was around 2003, and then the book was 2006. And it kind of started my career in a different way, where I was less in academia and a little more starting to have like public knowledge of what I was doing. And so I kind of ended up getting projects, often from people that I vaguely knew from a long time ago, who then were like, oh, she is a real architect. This is sort of how architecture is not, you can't like put a sign up and advertise architecture. You kind of, people have to hear about you in weird ways. So that's just my career advice. People starting firms ask me. But so then one of the things I've always been interested in is well, let's see, how do you incorporate like color, pattern, some of the sculptural aspects of design into architecture? I have always been a fan of Lina Bobardi. This is some sketches that Lina Bobardi made for a project that was an installation at her own SCSC Pompeia in Brazil. I'm sure you guys know, Sao Paulo. And this was done in the early to mid 80s. And I kind of learned about this project when I was working on another project. This is the Lina Bobardi in her own building, adaptive reuse building. And she has this quote, which is relevant to what I'm saying, in terms of, like, we can all be magpies from history. We can kind of pick and choose the things that we are interested in, bring them with us into contemporary moments in different ways. And I think it's really a wonderful way to think about it, as opposed to being so disciplinarily forced to toe the line. And Lina Bobardi really did do her own thing, big time. But right after that is when Deborah Sussman did this whole installation for LA, for the LA Olympics in 1984, which was pretty revolutionary. Some of the ideas from the Mexico City Olympics previously, but it was a purely graphic paper temporal city that was Deborah Sussman along with John Dirty's office, and everything's made out of paper, scaffolding, flags, and fabric, but they were able to transform a lot of Los Angeles into sort of a TV-friendly tableau full of this color palette. That was like a really new color palette. It was really the color palette, let's say, of the 80s it became, and like Benetton or something is sort of all related to this. So it became the sort of public expression of form without even having a physical form, but also I think it's not unrelated to Lina Bobardi, and ended up doing a show about Deborah Sussman in LA for Woodbury University, and meeting her before she died. But it was kind of one of the other things that went on with her and Lina Bobardi is that, frankly, they were not in the canon that I ever learned in school, because they were women and because they were, Lina was in Brazil, but also Deborah Sussman didn't even have a Wikipedia page when we did this show, and it was kind of shocking. So I do have an agenda where I kind of want to make sure people learn the people that got left out of 20th century history, because the folks who wrote it had a pretty particular point of view that wrote a lot of people out. So, but that idea that both of those architects brought is something that has been really useful for us in exhibition design. And I think this is a show that we did at LA County Museum of Art about the history of Scandinavian modernism in Los Angeles. Actually, that's where I really got to know a lot about Eliel Saarinen. I was just at Cranbrook today, and I have lots to say about that. But anyhow, so in this show, we were trying to do a design show about, I think it was 280 objects. And we've been to a lot of museum shows about design or architecture, are not very civilian friendly. They're like little models or some black and white drawings, a little photo here and there. So we wanted to create like an immersive experience for people to actually kind of hang out and feel like they were somewhere that they could study the objects more. We went back to the objects themselves to create this palette of color, of shapes, of textures, and materiality that literally became kind of big features within pretty blank set of 3 rooms in a gallery. It's in the Renzo Piano BCAM gallery. This is just the stuff of laying it out. But so the pieces, so it starts out with an installation of Greta Grossman's work. She was a Swedish architect in LA who ended up doing all these furniture lines. And so her furniture is inside of this piece. That cutout is from the shape of one of her lamps, and then it's wrapped in a Joseph Frank map of Manhattan that became a famous textile of Joseph Frank. So, but then the shape of the platform that she's on is also that same shape of that lamp. So there's this kind of, like, if you didn't see it, you maybe absorb some of those shapes and colors and stories just from the experience of visiting the exhibit. This is the Saarinen section, actually. So that blue angle is from one of Loja Saarinen's patterns, which is on the wall opposite. And the big pieces of wood throughout are kind of indirect Alvar Aalto references to Villa Myra and others, but also just the wood export of Scandinavia being like their primary export. This was an idea about another room that was about the marketing of Scandinavian work and kind of setting it up almost like a Viking ship of products, you know, with the Marimekko sails. Anyhow, but you can see also these are those same sauna tubes that were used in the LA Olympics. They had given us the freedom to make our installation of the show, which traveled around the world, like very LA specific. So we were kind of taking like the LA way of doing that. So a lot of, for me, content is really a big issue in terms of how what associations you can get your multiple readers to experience or multiple viewers. So that's that show. So along those lines, like using relatively inexpensive means, color and pattern and maybe shapes that aren't too elaborate, we did an adaptive reuse of a factory building in Los Angeles for the Silver Lake Conservatory of Music, which was a music school started by Flea of the Red Hot Chili Peppers and is an after-school music program and summer camp that's kind of hoping to fill the gap of the underfunding of music education in LA. And they had for a long time this little tiny space down the street, and it was actually in that Bohemian Modern book, which is kind of how I got to meet this gang. And then they got this wonderful bigger space. So this is from the opening. The building itself is a bowstring truss building, not quite big enough for 2 stories. And the goal really was to have both a storefront space that made the building kind of open to passersby. Previous to this, it had been like a Scientology Narcanon thing was like all blocked off on the outside, and so they wanted to we took out the front and add all these windows and openings, but then it's like a lobby here in the front, like a very informal, low-key lobby for parents and teachers and stuff to hang out in, and then it turns into like a little village for students. So this is that lobby, and then there's a kind of a set of practice rooms, like where all the classes are actually like little rehearsal rooms that are set up in a kind of Dr. Caligari-esque kind of little streetscape for students to walk around, and that's sort of scaled to the kid. And then in the middle of it all, we have a pretty big assembly space, and our codes require a huge, ridiculous amount of bathrooms as a result. And we didn't want to choke off the connection between the school and the assembly space, so we ended up just putting that right in the middle and using kind of the ideas from the silent disco project that Anya referenced, and making that kind of like a deconstructed disco ball to bring the light from the skylights around and also create circulation. So that's in the front, and then the back is really this big assembly space, and this is from the opening of that event. So that continues to be like a really kind of really great community space that it's actually where I met another client from another event there. So those are like using those kind of techniques, like the reflectivity, the graphics, and so on. In other projects, I'm just showing a smattering. These are some residential projects, and there's kind of a mixture of things that are about color, or else they're about the site, like the one that's in front of the Frank Lloyd Wright House on the upper right. But on the interiors, there tends to be another layer of atmospheric, I would say, layering. And so these are some of the different interiors from residential projects. Also, we did quite a lot of commercial projects for a while, so cafes and restaurants and art installations. And I don't actually have slides, but we've done quite a lot of pretty large-scale headquarters for Nike and Snapchat and Intuit right now, using these ideas of like how do you create moments for community and gathering, or like a coffee shop in the middle of a workspace, kind of like I was up at the studio today of the new reassembled graduate studio, and those kinds of ideas are very much what we work with when we're doing TI. It's called TI's tenant improvement, but big interior workspaces. How do you get people to come together? How do you make a creative space everybody actually wants to work there instead of like, I'd rather work from home in my closet kind of thing? Edward, how do you create a space where it's engaging enough that you don't really want to be on your phone? You kind of want to be a lot. You get someone enlivened by the atmospherics and the possibility for interaction with other people. So that's kind of like one thing, one chunk of stuff about color, pattern, et cetera. Another kind of train of thought is this idea of making form sort of in the city, or in, LA being like, probably like Ann Arbor, like city-ish, and a lot of it. And so Blackbirds was this project for 18 units of housing using something called the small lot ordinance, which in general was done like the image on the left, where and there are a lot of these around LA now. They're basically trying to let us create more housing as single family houses that you could buy with a typical mortgage instead of a condo, and it's like a better deal for people to own their own home in the land that it's on. So you could subdivide a lot to create all these spaces. So we were asked to do something that was maybe more appropriate to the site, which is in Echo Park and kind of a very complicated hillside. And we came up with this idea on the right that also helped kind of break it into pieces, where instead of it looking like 18 separate little boxes, it was kind of a community of 8 or 9 houses or 8 or 9 buildings. And so many of the houses, things that look like houses, are actually 2 full houses or 3 full houses, sort of disguised in the shape of one. And I was calling that idea stealth density. It's also built around a courtyard, a landscape courtyard, very designed courtyard that is where the parking is, but is also the space of community, and all the units sort of face into that space, but they all have sort of front and backyards as well. So this is sort of some rough models, E1 bond pictures. So that kind of shows the Richard Scarry-ish version of life there. But this is like a triplex. So these are 3 houses that have a 6-inch space between them, and then a roof that kind of appears to continue. They're actually separated by flaps. And the other thing, that by using that kind of shape, like kind of leaning into the gable world, it allowed us to create a lot of different sections that really increases the spatial differences and kind of breathability of these buildings. So like much higher ceilings in these staircases with indirect light, and different kinds of ceiling heights in the bedrooms accordingly. And hugging sites. This is like a staircase. It's also an office. It's also a laundry room. We use these big industrial window types that I think we saved like $490,000 on the original bids by switching to full-on storefront systems, which then made it like waterproof, but it gave you these much bigger expanses of glass. Pretty good for the views. There's also 2 different types of, so some of them are fiber cement board painted black, some of them are standing seam metal and white kynar, and that other kind of language between them helps kind of, again, make it feel more of a set of unique things rather than just kind of a mono concept project. There's a couple of single family houses in it too. One architecture critic kept calling it like the emoji face buildings because of this stuff, which is true, I guess. But and it kind of goes from site to site. They also are staggered so that you always can see above the other ones, and everybody gets these pretty great views of downtown. This is all grown in now with like trees and things, but no updated pictures from me. But the really fun thing for me was that actually, in terms of building and designing a community that fit into the larger context, people in this small community have started having like communal parties and like dinner parties, and kind of like that central courtyard has been getting used for other purposes than parking, and that was always the sort of a Dutch and Japanese idea of this parking that's also other things and adds to the community building. Along those lines, in terms of ideas for housing, which maybe are somewhat specific to LA, but we have a housing crisis, you may have heard. And so there was a competition about smaller scale density or medium density, low rise it was called. And I thought I would do a project on a site I know really well in Frogtown, where I did my thesis when I was younger. But which is like a piece of land that's next to the LA River, and was really kind of very small worker housing on very, very skinny lots, but very deep. And per McKinsey & Co., there's an idea that if we built if every house in California could build 4 units of housing in the back, we would solve all of our problems, and plus it would be an economic boom because everybody would own their own means of, rental income, et cetera. So we decided to do a sort of 4-square project for the site, particularly also keeping the context of the front, because it's like a not a wealthy neighborhood, so just not decimating what was there, so keeping that 1906 to 1918 sort of context, and then putting things in the back. So that this is sort of the bigger concept of how that might go, and then this is an illustration of our idea, which is really 4 almost Blackbird-y projects that are kind of grouped together around a central core, and also set down in the ground from passive cooling and as well as height. So we sort of made these winding, like multiple stairs, but they were kind of winding up through the middle, and then that's also acting as like a ventilation stack for natural cooling. There's a fun model. And on the other scale, we did another project that was also hypothetical for much denser housing. Another thing in Los Angeles is that we haven't really built a new street in Los Angeles since 1992 in Playa Vista, because our planning department is maybe not, the center of progressive planning, I would say. So we took this site that used to be train yards, and right now it's housing, was sold and not bought by the city like 20 years ago, and then it's just a bunch of like FedEx warehouses and just warehouse buildings and a sea of parking, and proposed that we connect it to the context near it, and also connect it to all these giant parks. This sort of black part is actually all these giant new parks that we're building right now with a lot of state tax money, but they're not accessible by the neighborhood. So the idea was to kind of heal that wound and use this idea of stacking the commercial parts of it, which are really vital for the tax base for a community, and stacking that vertically and then leaving the rest of it open for housing. That's kind of what these diagrams are. And so just imagining what that might look like. A little bit interested actually in Eliel Saarinen's ideas for Helsinki, which are quite an amazing set of drawings. Would you care to check it out? And which have the European block idea, but also in this case, there's these sort of separated parking stacks. So we were drawing different ideas around that. And here are some renderings. So all the higher bits are stepped back from the street. So there's sort of a streetscape that connects to those parks. And then, let's see. So beyond housing, I guess the way that Blackbird has that concept of stealth density and hiding things, I do think it's really great to be able to find a concept that's sort of readable to your average person, not just architects, in terms of why something is what it is, And so one of the jobs I had, or projects I had recently, an ongoing project, is working with Sunnylands, which is a big kind of famous compound in Rancho Mirage in the desert, designed by A. Quincy Jones in the late 60s for Walter Annenberg. And it's like where Obama goes golfing. It's the Camp David of the West Coast, basically. It's kind of they use it for political retreats. And then this is the main house that was done by A. Quincy Jones, and it's now sort of a museum, but it's also where they have these retreat functions. And A. Quincy Jones is sort of towards the end of his career, and he got a little bit like arm wrestled into having to make everything pink by the owners. But they also had all been spending time in Mexico. This is right when the amazing anthropology museum in Mexico City was done, and there was like a bit of a craze. So there's a lot of stuff around Rancho Mirage that's kind of inspired by late 60s modernist Mexico that translated into Palm Springs, painted pink. So there's a whole thing around shapes and forms, like this literally, a pyramid that's kind of taken from that. There's a big sculpture in the front. And so that, to me, the roof of this became like the iconic aspect of something that we wanted to relate to. We were asked to design a house for the president of the institute, but that house also was doubling as a hospitality space for events and so on. So we sort of took this pyramid thing and then decided to flip it and kind of turn it into something else, which is not unrelated to some other Palm Springs languages like those of Albert Frey. And then we have this very simple floor plan, maybe not real, with these big overhangs. So let me just get to the project. So this is the framing of that project. So it's kind of these huge overhangs that are the underside of which is going to be painted pink, and the top of which is reflective white. But it's But so the concept really drives the project, obviously, and it is going to then, it got connected then to this other structure behind it, which is this swimming pool and pavilion done by Fred Fisher recently. So this is our building, recently finished, not yet properly landscaped. And this is that context of Rancho Mirage, which is kind of near where the Indian Wells tennis thing is, if you know that kind of thing. And this is the house. I think this is a rendering, I think, but there's pictures too. And again, landscape is a big part of this because it's very indoor-outdoor. But if you've been to Palm Springs, like there's a famous Albert Frey building that was, I think, a gas station. Now it's the tourist information center. But I always loved the daringness of these giant overhangs, and I didn't know if you could get away with doing it, and you can, by the way. It's not the hardest thing, and we had to kind of chamfer the edges with these extra bits to get that line to thin out, and read in a disappearing way. So the biggest view of the structures are separated from the envelope, so we can have these glass walls and the furniture not by my office. Say no more. And we also, in the middle, but the famous thing in the Quincy Jones building, like that hut has this big atrium in the middle that's kind of great and has like weird plants in it and these pink columns. So we were sort of taking tropes from like the green columns are related to that. We made an atrium, although it's actually got a skylight on it, and it becomes this little sort of corner built-in nook. Looking through that window, we actually see Quincy Jones's own studio, which previously had been this addition to the ranch house that used to be there. So that was one of these sort of, like, what's the high concept, but then, of course, most of the decisions are more about the architecture itself or the project itself. Another project in Silver Lake is a house next to this house. Originally, it was an addition to this house. This is a Raphael Soriano from 1920 in the heyday of streamlined modern meets high modernism. And it's an extruded kind of boat shape with this really great round window for a piano, and our site now is where that arrow is. So we wanted to keep that. We wanted to keep that view clear, but we also we're looking for kind of a language for this house. And I thought that perhaps that if the A. Quincy Jones, if the Soriano is really this extrusion, planimetric extrusion, that we would do our project that has to step down the hill to stay out of that view corridor, that we'd sort of extrude the hillside as our shape that informed our building. So you can kind of see the story on the left and our project on the right. And also something that my new bag of tricks in terms of stealthiness, I guess, is starting to use scissor trusses, which I don't know if you're familiar with scissor trusses. They're an amazing way to save a lot of money on the framing, but they also let you can do any kind of shape on the inside of something that's not necessarily related to the outside. So you could have crazy shapes on the inside, a very simple outside, but you can also get all your gear, your HVAC, et cetera, running through it. So, and they also go up in about a day. So you frame your whole roof very quickly. So it's actually very economical, but also very custom. So it's kind of like, I was working on Silvertop at the time, the Lauder House, and I called this like the poor man Silvertop. So all kinds of strategies around wood framing. This is that house itself, and sitting below their house. It also has these views in both ways, one towards the ocean, one towards the mountains. And so the big goal was to keep the main floor pretty much open as a sort of pavilion zone. I mean, it could feel like a pavilion with these views. And also steps down the hill for outdoor functions. This is kind of what this is not really showing the scissor trusses. I think the next picture, that's the scissor trusses inside. Look them up. And on the outside, to get that to create that abstraction of that extruded piece, this is all done. It's all wrapped in TPO, which is that vinyl roofing that you put on a Home Depot, super thick, completely fireproof, and really great for abstraction. Although not that many people want to do it for you because the verticals or seams involve a lot of welding of vinyl. But it does do this really great job of wrapping the part that we wanted to kind of create the abstract language out of in a very inexpensive assembly of wood, scissor trusses, and vinyl. So we kind of get our sculptural yayas without doing like a giant rain screen or something, which would cost a lot of money. And then you can kind of see how open that living room is. And on the inside, so we keep you see this stepping of the roof, but just happens to be different roofs that are stepping. So it's a dishonest section, but yet in spirit kind of related to the exterior. This is in the kitchen. Those kids requested a bunk bed in the kitchen, as they do. Also using kind of industrial scale windows here. That's the back view. So another, it's not really, it's related in a different way, but so another project, sort of about context. This is a winery in Napa Valley called Ashes and Diamonds, and this project was for the youth, the child of another vintner who had a very, let's say, Versailles-inspired winery. If you've been to Napa Valley, most of the wineries have a theme. You know, they're Tuscan or they're French Loire or they're something like that. A lot of them are barns now. But so there's an idea of like branding and architecture that's a big part of it. And these tasting rooms are kind of tricked out. So our idea with our client was to kind of say like, well, let's make ours more about the fact that the California wine business is itself a post-war industry. You know, it really started after World War II, and we're going to use California design post-World War II as the language for the brand of this winery. And they were on board for that. And so we have two things. We have a big metal building that's partially prefab and partially customized. So the big circle parts are an office, and that has our sort of some Albert Frey references in the folding roof. I was working on a bunch of stuff in Palm Springs at the time, so it's kind of into those Wexler roofs. That becomes a shade structure. We didn't have the money, frankly, to build something that had that shape, you know, but we could use it as a sort of Venturi-esque sign. This is set back from the roadside too, so you sort of see that rippling roof. And the building underneath it, the tasting room, is actually almost like a supersized made case study house in that it's, you know, very big, simple volume, and then the shape is given by the shade structure. This is the site beforehand. These are some of those languages, Albert Frey on the left, Wexler on the right. This is the functional diagram. We also got to do the landscape in this. And this is that tasting room separated stage. We do actually, it's incredibly hot in Napa Valley a lot of times. You actually need these shade structures and you have sprinklers in them and so on, so you can kind of constantly cool off outdoors. Our landscape. This is that altered, so the sort of prefab, very inexpensive metal building with some alterations as a crush pad in it, you know, wine storage. And underneath it is one of the, like, there's like a sort of a VIP lounge underneath it, tucked inside and outside. There's a lot of events at these wineries. And then this is the kind of more front of house visitor center tasting room. Of course, on the inside, we wanted to lean into California design, so we have a lot of themes, but we also have, you know, sort of Herman Miller classics of post-war era, and consciously sort of decorated it to kind of have that case study thing, which again, in Napa Valley is very unusual and therefore kind of a big brand move. And yeah, it's been super successful actually. Like it's one of the big new wineries in town because it's also, they're also trying to, the owner wanted to have younger people interested in going there that didn't sort of, you know, have a more with it atmosphere. So a new project that we're doing that kind of really gets going in January is a project for this artist, Lauren Halsey, who has a nonprofit called Sum Everything. And she's famous, maybe you know her project on the rooftop of the Met a couple of years ago, where it was this monument, kind of almost Egyptian monument to her neighborhood in South Central, but done in these giant white panels. That's actually getting installed right now in LA on a public site. And then this is a building at her studio compound, which is in South LA in a warehouse district. But this is a program kind of like Silver Lake Conservatory of Music. It's going to be an art and technology program, after school program for kids. She's about a block from a big junior high school and high school that has terrible resources. And one of her goals as an artist of South LA is to kind of bring art education into her neighborhood. Because of where it is and because it's actually kind of got a lot of issues around this neighborhood, part of the idea too is to make this a kind of an oasis for kids that's kind of hidden inside the context of the industrial zone. So we're keeping the perimeter completely intact. Like this is sort of the front elevation of the studio, and on the upper right is kind of a hat of what we're building. So we're building a structure that is It also has a big garden oasis, but it inhabits a little bit of the existing building, and then we kind of cut it off and then build our new larger structure behind it. The idea is to have a big public space as well as classrooms for art, music, and technology. There's some interior views, but the structure of this, so the idea was to take a shape that was sort of an exaggeration of an industrial shed, kind of sawtooth project, and then use that to fit our 2 stories and 1 double height space inside of it. But then again, creating different kinds of rooms inside. So this is kind of, it's almost anti-scissor truss because we're creating shapes that are like negative space out of it. Here's just the shape itself. Here's the red, so you can kind of see in this drawing the front that's intact. That's like a 2-story office space right now. That's still going to be part of our building, and then the rest of it is kind of popping up through inside the neighborhood. There's another view. Super excited about this project. And then lastly, I just want to show a couple of houses. They're this first one is in the wake of the Palisades fire. As you know, Palisades and Altadena both burnt terribly. I have a project in the Altadena as well, but I just wanted to show one of these projects that are part of a group of people trying to rethink the case study program from the late 60s, building ideas of how to build modernism for people in general through model houses. And so we have a project that in plan kind of takes a lot of those case study ideas of the inside and outside as a 1-story project. We have a courtyard. We have an existing pool. Like everyone's house burned down, but not their pool. So the pool's there. And then you kind of the idea is this sort of corridor that weaves through and has a lot of transparency around this courtyard. So we have like a kind of indoor garden and 2 outdoor gardens and bedrooms kind of strung along. But where we wanted to do something different from like a case study thing was that in section, the different parts of it sort of pop up and have different roof lines that also allow us to have different sections. So there's a real variety of spaces on the interior. So these are kind of sketch models of that idea. But so the courtyard is separate from like a roof deck on a garage. It's sunken, and then there's a big living area, and then there's a set of bedrooms that all have different things. So sort of like a village aspect, and then a single corridor that's like a 1 line that goes through it. So rendering of that. So this one keeps changing because it's still under design, and it's going to start DD soon. But this is kind of the latest of this project. I'm excited because it's so case study, but then not, Another project that we finished recently is a project, a restoration / huge addition to a house by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright named Foster Rhodes Jackson, who is, I would say, extremely eccentric, went to Taliesin for a while, not sure how long, moved to Claremont, Pomona, and Claremont in the Pomona Valley was this huge crafts and kind of art center in the mid-century era. There are a lot of ceramicists. Sam Malouf, the woodworker, was there. Actually, a few Lautner houses around there, kind of clustered around Claremont colleges. And Foster Rhodes Jackson had this one client, the Hasifs. This whole family kept commissioning him to these houses, and they're very this is the original drawing for this house that we worked on. Very early Taliesin. Although these drawings, like that drawing that we're looking at, is from like the late 50s, which is kind of amazing because it's supposed to be from 1925, I think. But anyhow, this house kind of turned into one of those ongoing projects between the architect and the owner, and then also the owner and various handymen for a really long, and women, I guess, forever. So from like 1960 to 1998 or something, it just kept getting added onto. And when our client he passed away, when our client bought it, they thought it was all sort of real estate, like 9,000 square feet of real estate. It turned out that only maybe half of that had ever been permitted. Half of it didn't actually have foundations. It was completely moldy and falling down. So we had this really interesting project of kind of restoring parts of it, fixing things, and then building new things where things were unsalvageable. So it was this really long interactive relationship with Foster Rhodes Jackson, and he's got some writing as well that was kind of interesting. So here's sort of a vision of what it was, let's say circa 1970 or something. And this is an illegible map of the new parts and the old parts, but the pink is the new parts. we'll see that. But this is what it looks like now. So we built, we have built a whole other line of building in the back that I'll show you, and then these are some parts in the front that are restored, and some of them are just reimagined. This was just an architectural digest, that's why I have really fancy photographs of it. But it's kind of amazing because one of the things I love about working on Wright houses I love also, but it happens sometimes in the Schindler houses that there's just a lot of inventive design at the micro level as well as the macro level. And sometimes it's like an entire idea of window systems. In this house, there's this folding wood screen that happens constantly in the old part that we ended up using as the exterior of the new part that we were doing. You kind of can find a whole language from the original architect to kind of work with to make other parts of it. Not that we're don't want to make things that look like fake the original architect. We want to make things that are distinguishable as different, but still related in terms of tone and atmosphere. This is actually on the right, it's a new wall by us, but this is the Saint-Malo staircase. I'll just show these nice pictures. So like this room has a ceiling that's actually like a kind of plexiglass skylight that was in another one of these parts that was illegal that we had to take out. So we sort of kept that and then turned it into a light fixture and put it into this dining room that we made with this folded pattern. This is a concrete culvert that I used to create like an opening and window through partial wall. There's also a window seat on the outside that kind of was like another interaction with the original. Because I wouldn't do this on something that was fully intact. I was in Landmark, but because half of it was not there, we have this funny relationship of cutting in discussion. This is a new part that we built out. And one of the things was to kind of add this language. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of stained glass that was done in the 70s that has a very organic language, although the house itself does not have that. It is very rectilinear, so we're trying to bring that organic layer in through our windows, so all of our windows read as new in relationship. This is a drawing of the Saint-Malo staircase that's quite lovely, and then we kind of added this window layer around it, refinding pieces of the stained glass and kind of repositioning them throughout the house. This is some of the new part on the right that we did, as well as rebuilding all the skylights. This new section, living room and another garden. This is kind of our new section on the right, using the same skylight language. Also, we reconfigured the inside to make it essentially like 6 suites. So it's it's like a family vacation compound. So kind of each suite has got its own language and furniture. That's the overview. And my last project I want to show you is a project that's just finishing right now. It's a house. I kind of went small, large, extra large. So this is a very large project that's in Seattle on the Puget Sound. That dock in the background is the dock for the Vashon Ferry. And this house is oriented to catch this view that we're kind of looking, if you look down, we're looking at the mouth of the Puget Sound. So it's got this, sometimes there's tankers kind of going by, sometimes there's sailboats. We're doing an art studio as well as a new house. And plan, the art studio is on the lower left and the house is the middle part. It's also adjacent to a house that the client owns it. They're going to turn into a guest house. This is the exterior, currently not quite finished. And those are the sites. So in the plans, the studio's on the right, an art studio and garage, and then the main house is sort of three bars, but the entryway is meant to be this very organic kind of knuckle joint that has a big staircase in it, but also sort of brings you in with views out and indoor-outdoor sort of spaces in a more organic way, and then kind of clarifies into these different wings. And the second level has that piece, that curving staircase, which is clad in green tile, and then that also has an indoor-outdoor kind of front and back upstairs living room. There's some models. So the pink is actually a green staircase. There's a green roof on this house as well. Here's like that starting. This is a view from the one of the terraces over to that art studio behind it. That's the studio on the left, and this is the entrance. So you kind of go underneath this overhang, and then that's where the organic kind of circulation core happens. That's the studio. It's very simple background. This inside the studio, very simple building. This is at the main house on the exterior. This is looking at it from the other house at the view of the sound. So partially the wood, one of the clients' goals was for us to bring a kind of California idea of color and openness to the Northwest. I don't know if you've been there, but I looked at a lot of their AIA awards, and everything's like blackened, wood, whatever it is, Dubon or whatever. And so sort of like, this is meant to be sort of light colors and a light wood, and just it's kind of meant to be cheery in those dark Seattle winters. So we have all these spaces made out of this tile zone, different kinds of gardens. So on the inside, this is like earlier, but this is sort of how that organic part. So there's a bench outdoors on the left, and then the staircase that winds up on the right. This is it in progress. There's kind of starting to come together. And then we have these kind of fins that guide you along that part. The language on the inside is maybe also like how we brought color into this house and the kind of palette of that. There's an interior designer as well, but we usually get to do all the stuff that's nailed down. So there's kind of intentional color moments that are kind of tying the different things together and highlighting it. So this is in the main living room, the beams and the tile fireplace and the kitchen stuff is sort of all related to these highlights. There's a stone fireplace that kind of bleeds onto the floor, and it's also the backdrop. It's actually a pizza oven. We're in rich people land here, obviously. Sorry. And we had different kind of craftspeople come in to do different parts. So there's a servery that's done by this artist, Vince Skelly, who kind of carved this whole wooden servery around the kitchen edge. This obviously pretty carefully drawn stonework. We had someone make this copper multifaceted tabletop. I guess this is what I was thinking about, just because of going to Cranbrook today, like that level of detail and the kind of carving is. I do think it's fair game for architects to reclaim like the craft of the things that are building elements that are built in. Like, how do we get our hands back on that? Because if you haven't noticed, that's sort of gone over to the world of interior design, which is often very cut and paste imitation, I think. But our traditions, and especially around here, you see it in spades, is how do we kind of get out of here are the rules and kind of make things more of an exploration of formal moments and crafts within the building. This is interiors person, but I do love this pattern. This is the media room. We made a curved reading room. They tricked it out in crazy fabric, which is pretty fun. This is our part, a little bar tucked away behind some stairs. This is the view back at the Puget Sound. And then this is in this bedroom suite. This is kind of the very architectural kind of wood world with this crazy view. So there's two roofs that come up and a curving piece that carries this bed. And this is the bed with the mushroom rug. And there's a piece of mirror that's hiding a big, so you don't see the curving as well, but there's this double curve. It's sort of like you're in a tent and the whole wall is glass that opens up. And I think that's my last picture. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. We can do if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Were they organic and done by the owners? Yes. I just happened to get invited to one, so I had a picture. I had like I should have brought a photographer. I had like a bad picture, but yes. And it's 18 houses, so everybody knows each other. All their kitchens face into that courtyard, so you kind of know if people are around. I thought it'd be all young families, but it's actually like a mixture of empty nesters and then like YouTube influencers and then other people. So it's kind of it's nice. It's like a it's probably a little bit like a cul-de-sac, like it's this group of houses that have some overlap, but not, I don't think they lack privacy, but they kind of have just a general knowledge of each other. And the big thing is also because the parking isn't enclosed, so you don't like drive into your garage and ever say hi. I mean, you sort of have to kind of see people by going in and out of your car the way you might on like a regular street if you're in Ann Arbor or something. Well, I guess I'm old enough, as are you probably, for the cycles to have turned around. Like when I was in college, Homo was big and we hated it, and then in grad school too, it's like, ugh, you know. But at the same time, Gary and Morphosis were big, but they're technically also kind of postmodernist if we look at it through a critical lens, Um, but the I would say, what was it, 15 years ago, like the return of extreme, like Sam and Fat and all that kind of extreme postmodern coming back. And then for a while, I'm on the board at SciArc, and for a couple of years, like every single project, like a pink bubblegum project. You're like, what is going on? But it's fun. But I was like, I don't know, whatever. And so I kind of try to stay out of that direct trending, but I don't mind it. Like I think it's kind of fun to see what people are up to. Um, this is an aside as a dorky faculty type thing, but I was on a review of first year grad students at UCLA a couple years ago, and their text was what's his name's French hotel plan. Do you know what that is? Like that from like, it was like the big text that GSD used in like the mid 80s to justify postmodern. Everything should look like a French hotel. And it was like, what is this? And I was like, it's back. I couldn't believe it. I was like on a review. I was like, you're kidding me. That's what you're reading? Like that is the funniest thing I've ever heard. But anyhow, I mean, it's fun. So I guess I feel like we're at a moment where there is the rules are weird, and that it's just trying to keep your eyes open and think about how, if we're trying to create meaningful spaces or places that have some kind of meaning, or kind of even just create a sense of I'm not gonna say sense of place, but a kind of sense of specificity that in an atmosphere, like some great coffee shops do, or some incredible museums do, or just everything in between, that you kind of have to open yourself up to the tools of like what you see around you and what you think is interesting, and just bring it to the table, because no one else, you're the architect, no one else is going to do it. You can't wait for the brand designer to do something that's not just derivative. So I think I haven't gotten to the level of like designing furniture and stuff, because that, I think it's pretty fetishist. I mean, yes, built-in's not necessarily, but I do think there's a lot of territory that we don't really teach anymore that is around that level of what can you do with, like the carved stone signage at the Art Museum and Library at Cranbrook. I was like, that is so, I mean, I'm going to do that next expensive rich person house I get, because it's so cool. I didn't know you could even do that. Like, just have to kind of like researching and looking at things. And yeah, so I think it's not, I do think it's the magpie of history. It's like the history is there, and there's so many great things. A lot of the stuff that I first used to get influenced by was even like 17th century houses in New England that are just covered in one color, like like the dilapidated farmhouse is all red or it's all black or something. Like that use of color as opposed to sort of the trim and the more like late 19th century Victoriana. I thought that was really powerful, and it's so modern, and yet it's 300 years old. So that kind of finding things that speak across history that can become, and I do think it resonates with civilians, to have something that's thoughtful. I don't really know what it's about. It's not like, here's a sign, this is from Greece or something, but it has a great atmosphere or something. And it's, I used to have my motto, it still is, I didn't show it, but like everyone should experience strange beauty every day. So like everyday life is where meaningful things happen. How can you make them like slightly beautiful in a way that is just, you sense it somehow, like almost somatically or something. And there's one. Well, first of all, I actually really like Peter's Inventory a lot, and I'm a big fan of the new museum, so come to LA and check it out. But yeah, stylistically, I guess his budgets and crafts people are kind of a different level than what we have here in the US of A, just FYI. Um, but also there's definitely an aspect of minimalism in his work, right? And he always says he comes from like crafts at the level of like he was a cabinet maker and he was making the building as a cabinet or something like that. I would say I'm maybe not I'm a little bit interested in like the creative direction of things because I think that there's all these layers of meaning and symbolism that people read that aren't necessarily just the space. You know, they aren't just the Kimball Museum. It's also like other stuff in life because you're not, and that's maybe because I'm more interested in informal architectures. You know, like I'm not that interested in monuments and making monumental projects. I kind of like informal formalism is what I would say. So. But I don't know that, I guess I would say that the design, what was it called? You can say tectonics. The theory of it all is just that things do have to have some meaning and ideally not, like it's very useful as a designer to have it to help guide your decision making and make things better as opposed to it being the post rationalization. You're right. Like after you did the thing, you're like, oh, actually, this was about whatever. Because everybody can do that. That's so easy. It's just rhetorical. But if you can kind of have a couple of ideas that are interesting, that you tried to fight to get them into the project, it really just tends to end up leading you down unexpected directions because they are coming. It's more conceptually driven. You know, my stuff doesn't look that conceptual, but usually there's like some conceptual stuff in the beginning that is helping guide it. And within my office, like I'm the that's like the funny role. I'm like the concept czar. You know, I'm like, no, this does not work conceptually. So no, like, but even with something that's like, it's really beautiful, but like, I don't know, like if it's, yeah, but sometimes you're just looking for something that's more, you know, you get the tent bedroom or something like that, then that sort of becomes worth it. You're like, what do we have to do to make this feel like a wooden tent, you know? And then that starts to change the roof line and all this other stuff happens. So, but I don't, yeah, no grandiose theory of practice at this point in time, unless maybe Anya could write me one because I bet she could. Because I'm like, whatever you said, can I get that? I'm gonna have to do a book soon. I'm gonna have you write the intro. Now I know. Any other questions? Oh, we got one. I would say that's not the first thing. I think that is I kind of think of it as this whole toolbox that's this extra layer once you get past the spatial imagining because it just is where you get to do all those layers of information. So it's it's almost like you know, the poor man's Barcelona pavilion, instead of cladding everything in, you know, whatever stone slab. They're like, can't afford that, so maybe we'll do it in mirror vinyl, you know. But kind of where can you get those textures? Because in most American construction, you just don't, you know, especially all these giant TIs that we do. Those are practically acres of, you know, spaces, and they would just be drywall if you don't have other things that you could do with it. And so you kind of start to carve space and add color pattern. But I guess the graphic sensibility, I don't think that we're trained in that as architects. I wouldn't even, I mean, I have an interest, but I also, like in terms of designing a book, I would still have my friends at college because they're so much more sophisticated about how to do stuff on 2 dimensions. But in 3 dimensions, I think it's actually a pretty great set of tools for us, whether it's the fact that you can now print out any freaking wallpaper pattern you want and put up on your wall in like 2 seconds because, you know, just our printing processes are so easy, or even if you want to 3 dimensionally fabricate like a, what is that, Japanese, you know, like in Paris, there's all those beautiful drawing rooms of like carved bridges and stuff on the walls. You could just do that with a 3D printer and like be done in about a week and put it out, you know, stuff like that. That is just kind of these tools for layering and emotional kind of atmospherics that are coming through that, and they aren't just the color and pattern. They are kind of the, I think like Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum is such a great example. Like I don't even know what that building is because each room is so different and the interiors are so different that's like, I mean, that's leather and whatever, but you could do that with other tools and get those effects. But I still think the architecture, the three-dimensional space is probably the most important thing, like the light and the space, and then you have that to layer onto.
So you had said that it was stuck. By that, do you mean, it's kind of looks like single family.
It still did. I mean, it's so funny because it got so much pushback, and now everyone's like, "Oh no, it's so great."
Yeah,
of course. Someone else had put together some parcels and was going to build like a 30-unit apartment block, because technically the zoning allowed you to do that. And that street would have been very hard because the site really was kind of like three-dimensional, super complicated. But the person who did that decided not to pursue it. They would have had so much community resistance too. It would have been hard to do. But then my clients bought it. They were developers, they were people who had previously bought apartment buildings and just kind of fixed them up and rented them for more. So this was their first foray into building something, but I think they had someone do the scheme that I showed, like the blank one, where you kind of like somehow create like a flat level zone and plunk some stuff on it. And they didn't think it was going to work out so well. And so I had done a couple things that they'd seen it. So they hired me to do it based on something I'd done. And I made a deal with them, which cost me a lot of money, but in the end, it's probably my most well-known project. It was kind of like, it was worth it as an investment to actually get it built. It took a long time because the city was a new program in the city to do small lots. But the stealth thing was, it was both, I would say it was, like, I'm not the biggest fan of like a million teeny houses thing, either. Like, I think that it kind of looks like Levittown Redux to me sometimes. So I think in the sense of, on that site, and with the possibility of really carving the land to kind of get these different elevations and sections and views, it had this great possibility. But I do think we did a bunch of studies of like the whole neighborhood, and the massing really is not dissimilar to the single family houses around there. Even like the triples are kind of like, look like 1.5 houses, and that, so the fact that you can kind of get, it's medium density, it's not high density, but like medium density into what mostly looks like a single family neighborhood, I thought was really successful. I mean, not successful, like that was the goal, and then it did work, and it was more expensive to build, but then they sold for more than they thought they would. So it was kind of it was like good design sells. Really what was expensive about was frankly the site work though, because carving that hill and all the retaining that we had to do was, not that everyone would have had to do that as well, but they would have done like an underground parking garage or something horrible. So, yeah. But yeah, I want to do something like that again, but it's kind of, you have to like, I don't think architects like me have the personality to actually go be developers. I always think like, oh, I should be a developer. Like, I don't have the heart. I'd be like, spend every minute, every penny on making it nicer. It would not work out well financially, but whatever. Mm. 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 Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a whole nother one talk I could do, which is about the Tale of Two Cities, which would be the Palisades and Altadena, which, I mean, a lot of this is to say it's about capitalism, right? People have mortgages, they're owned by banks. If you don't rebuild your house, you lose all your money. You kind of don't have a choice, basically, the bottom line. And insurance will pay to build it, but they won't really give you a rent if you don't, and the lot values are not well. So there's that. So there's, let's say it's in the Serenity Prayer Department, it's not swinging the architect's control whether people are building their house or not. I've certainly, I think that the danger, and I have said that to a lot of people, like, you know, there's different kinds of forests you could be next to. In the world of climate change, you don't want to be next to the big crazy forests. You kind of, city forests are generally okay because they're well maintained, but there's that. There's lack of infrastructure. I was saying LA hasn't built a new road. Like Palisades only has 2 roads. Right now, construction is 3 hours to get a truck in there. I have 4 projects starting construction there soon. And people are gonna have to start work at like 5 or something to get a dirt truck, let alone, we're not gonna talk about concrete trucks, but like those kind of logistics, I'm hoping will increase the amount of, let's say, urban infrastructure that we need to do that. Altadena is in this horrible situation of being in it's not in LA, it's an unincorporated LA County, and it's like the Wild West. There's no government per se. There's no real rules. There's like the water sources or water districts are all independent and don't really have clear authority over anything. The fire department won't give anyone a permit right now until the fire hydrants have water in them, but nobody knows when or how that will happen. And then plus people were consistently underinsured because it's a poor area and the lot value is lower, and they're all haven't got redlined because of the forest next to it. So that I think is going to be this crisis in LA and of like heart and conscious and economics. And obviously, you know, in a historically Black neighborhood, there's also, it's kind of where a lot of creative types from my neighborhood moved when they had kids. They got a bigger yard and stuff, and then they've lost everything. So that is, so I have a couple of projects there which are basically pro bono. I'm like trying to help people figure out. Linda Tallman's doing some good stuff there because she's got a prefab that is really pretty good and much cheaper than most things. So, you know, but it's still the budgets are so impossible. Plus, you can't get a permit. So there's that. But yeah, I think I would say fire resiliency and the logic around that is not the hardest thing to solve. Most stuff that was built in LA is either craftsman or ranch houses that have overhanging eaves with basic, what do you call it, aerating things that the embers just go in and then they just blow up the houses from the inside. That's what happened to everybody. Like the houses blew up from the inside. That's why it's so crazy. And then they blow up next house with the embers. And so the new buildings are obviously, we're not going to be building that way. We don't build that way anyhow. But yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of stuff that is like how much can you control and how much can you not, you know. I think there's possibly what would be a good outcome maybe is that if Altadena gets rezoned and you can actually build some medium density, you could kind of pull away from the edge, you could kind of do a lot more houses that are nice, but it may also go the way of speculative development and just crazy people from Florida to finish building the villages and we're like, it's so down in Altadena, like you don't know, but we don't have control of it. It's horrible. But anyhow, yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.